Okay, sorry for the muffled sound, but I'm wearing a dust mask, which, by the way, you should always do, especially in an environment where you're working with a lot of dust in the air and moreover with possible glass fiber dust, coming from the insulation wool you see all around. So yeah, it's always best to wear a mask. Now, as you can tell, the insulation is pretty much done. Actually, no, it is done. And while I was insulating the roof, I noticed a crack in one of the load-bearing beams, and you can see that I temporarily repaired it with some industrial strength glue all the way up to there in the corner. Now I don't altogether trust the glue to be able to hold up against the big load on the roof, especially, well, static loads maybe, but dynamic loads created by wind gusts and possibly snow or rain, not so much. So I'm going to reinforce the beam with clamps that I made. And the clamps are made out of soft steel, and in fact, if you look at it, what I actually did or ended up doing was buying 2 hinges made out of soft steel. Yeah, where are they? Ah, here. So like this, okay, which I grinded in pieces with an angle grinder, and I enlarged the holes with a step bore, a step drill. I'm sure you know the kind I'm talking about. It looks like a pyramid of several drills, one after another. Yeah, and these are soft steel, and if you're interested in the size, let's see, the size is it's about 3 centimeters or 30 millimeters wide, and it is 3 millimeters thick. Okay, so it's a 3 millimeters thick, and I'm going to use 14 millimeter stainless steel threaded rod to tie them together. So if how to picture this, if the beam is in between, yeah, you will clamp this onto the beam like that, okay, so like this, all right, and the beam, its widest side will sit in this direction, yeah, its smallest side will sit like here, all right, and this will clamp the beam together. So we're using 14 millimeter stainless steel rod, threaded rod, and we're using self-locking nuts, 14 millimeter, so M14 nuts, all right, so like these. So that's the plan, and all I need to do now, whoops, is to figure out on the beam. So I'm planning to place a clamp somewhere at 2/3 of the beam, and at 1/3 of the beam, and 2/3 of the beam. So I need to measure the distance of the beam right up to there. So I mean the length of that piece of beam, and then divide it by 3, and then figure out where the clamps need to come. So that's the plan, and that's what I'm going to do right now. Alright, so how do you get a nut onto this threaded rod? If you don't have a clamp to clamp it down solidly to turn the lock nuts onto them, well, you can solve that problem by in 2 steps. First, you take, say in my case, a wrench, an adjustable wrench like this, and you take a socket wrench like this. Alright, so what you simply do is you start threading both nuts on this rod, for example, together. So on one end with the wrench, on the other with the socket wrench, and whichever bolt, or nut I should say, moves first up the rod ends up to be the one that we'll want to keep. So once that is done, you'll need a third nut to lock the nut which is part up the rod in place. I'll show you the next step when I'm done. Alright, so here you see part of the process. So as you can tell, one nut stays locked. Come on, focus. One nut stays locked on one end of the rod. The other one has been overcome by the wrench forces, you know, the torque forces, and is going down the rod precisely as we wish. So what I do is I clamp the rod down there and put my socket wrench on top, and then I just wrench like this. Yeah, okay, now I'm doing it with one hand to show you what I'm actually doing, but that's what I'm actually, well, that's what I'm doing. I'm wrenching both nuts closer together, and then there's an extra step, and I'll show you that when I'm done. Alright, I threaded on a third nut onto the rod. Alright, so now this nut here is only there temporarily as a lock nut, which will keep this one in place. And so now, instead of trying to wrench this nut up the rod, we just reverse the methodology, and now we're threading on this nut down the rod. And I actually need to thread it down until this edge hits about 3.5 centimeters, which would make it like a little bit less than 1.5 inch down the rod. Okay, so that's what I need to do now. Once this nut is down where it needs to be, I undo the lock nut, so the one at the very bottom, and move it up here and lock this nut in place, and then we start all over again threading the other nut up the rod. So there you go. I threaded this nut up the rod until this point here reached about 3.5 centimeters, so let's say a bit less than 1.5 inch. And now all I need to do is to undo these two bolts, and then we have two pre-threaded or pre-loaded, you could say, rods. Okay, and after I've done these two, I need to do two more of these, and then we can start fixing the clamp onto the beam. Alright, I am nearly done placing the first clamp around the beam. Now some of you might wonder why do I use soft steel as the jaws of the clamp instead of hard steel? Okay, just for a reminder, the threaded rod you see there is stainless steel. Okay, that's pretty hard steel. Now this is soft steel. I mean, soft in the sense that I think some people call it mild steel, which means that if you put a reasonable amount of force on it, the steel will bend and will stay in its bent shape. Alright, whereas hard steel, you can bend that, but when you release it, it will come back in its original shape. Alright, so the reason why I use mild steel or soft steel as the clamping jaws, you could say, is because I don't want to crush the wood. Okay, so that's not my intention. I want to keep the wood pieces of the beam together, you know. So as you can tell, the beam has been compromised, has been weakened by a long tear through the wood, you know. I don't know when it happened exactly, but it must have been a couple of years ago, I'm thinking. And rather than letting the tear open more and more, I wanted to simply clamp it together, hold it together, glue it with some industrial strength glue, and have the clamp act as a sort of, you could say, a spring more than a clamp. Okay, so the wood will work a bit, so it will move up and down a bit, but the clamp I'm making is solid enough, but it also has enough give not to rip apart the wood. Okay, so not to shred the wood, and that's my intention. I just want to keep the wood parts together without crushing or ripping them apart. Okay, so that's why I'm using mild steel. So there, I'm almost done with the first clamp at the first third of the beam. Okay, now I need to move down the beam and place another clamp somewhere around there, I'm guessing. Okay, sorry for the muffled sound, but I'm still wearing my my dust mask. But there you go, both clamps are installed on the beam, and the clamps combined with the glue should reinforce the beam forever. Well, for as long as the house will stand here. So now I have to move on and start insulate start insulating the floor. Oh dear.